It was a sunny Saturday morning like any other when my wife Sophie came to find me in the garage where I was doing some DIY. I was putting away my tools, covered in dust, when she announced the news that would change our weekend. Her mother, Margaret, had decided to come see our new house for the first time. I froze in place, a wrench in my hand. Margaret had always been the type to criticize our decisions from the beginning of our relationship. I still remember her reaction when we announced our marriage, a simple disapproving nod and a "if you're sure." That said a lot. "When is she arriving?" I asked, trying to hide my concern. "In 2 hours," Sophie replied, biting her lip. She knew as well as I did that this kind of impromptu visit did not bode well. I spent the next hour frantically cleaning the house, checking every corner, every surface. Sophie was adjusting the sofa cushions for the 10th time when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. When I opened the door, Margaret was there, standing as stiff as a board, in her impeccable grey suit. Her perfectly styled hair and precise lipstick contrasted with our slightly disheveled appearance despite our efforts. Without even a greeting, she walked in, immediately scanning our living room like a scanner looking for the slightest flaw. The atmosphere immediately became heavy, as if someone had thrown a wet blanket over our shoulders. Sophie and I exchanged a nervous glance as her mother began her silent inspection. The only sound in the room was the ticking of our wall clock and the rustling of her clothes as she moved. I tried to break the ice. "Did you have a good trip, Margaret?" My question hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. "The traffic was dense," she finally replied without looking at me, focused on the family photos hanging on the wall. "These frames aren't really straight, are they?" Sophie hurried to adjust them, even though I knew perfectly well that they were perfectly aligned. I felt a knot forming in my throat. This visit was going to be even more difficult than expected. Margaret continued her methodical inspection, stopping in front of each piece of furniture as if she were evaluating a real estate property. Her heels echoed on our wooden floor, a sound that reverberated like a countdown to an impending catastrophe. "The living room is interesting," she commented with that particular tone that suggested exactly the opposite. "These curtains are an original choice." The word original in her mouth sounded like a barely veiled insult. I looked at our beige curtains, perfectly normal, wondering what could be so terrible about them. Sophie, who had chosen them with such enthusiasm, now seemed to doubt every decorating decision we had made. The air in the room was becoming increasingly dense, as if we were locked in a greenhouse in the middle of summer. Margaret continued her tour, occasionally touching a piece of furniture with her fingertips as if to check for dust. Her silence was more eloquent than any verbal criticism. I could see Sophie following her mother like a shadow, ready to justify each of our decorating choices. But Margaret asked no questions, made no comments. She just observed, judged silently, and that attitude was perhaps worse than all the criticisms she could have made. In the kitchen, Margaret began her meticulous inspection as if she were a health inspector in a restaurant. She opened each cabinet with deliberate slowness, examining the organization of our dishes and utensils. I could almost hear her mentally counting the chipped plates. "Don't you have a complete set?" she asked, noticing our eclectic collection of plates. Sophie blushed slightly. "We like to mix styles," she replied softly. "It gives the table more personality." Margaret emitted a small hum that said a lot about what she thought of our concept of personality. She continued her exploration, opening the refrigerator without even asking for permission. Her eyes scanned the shelves, stopping at each item as if she were taking inventory of a store. "Industrial sliced cheese," she muttered, more to herself than to us. "And these vegetables should have been eaten 2 days ago." I clenched my fists in my pockets, reminding myself that she was my wife's mother and that I had to remain polite. Sophie hurried to explain that we hadn't had time to do the shopping that week, but her justifications fell on deaf ears. Margaret then took a handkerchief from her pocket and ran it over the top of the cabinets, checking for dust. Her face wrinkled in disgust when she saw the slight grey mark on the white cloth. "Do you clean regularly?" "Of course," I replied, feeling the anger rise. "But you know, we both work, so sometimes." "Precisely," she interrupted, "if you both work, you could afford a housekeeper. Unless." She left her sentence hanging, but the insinuation about our financial situation was crystal clear. The tour of the bathroom was even more painful. Margaret examined every tile joint as if she were looking for evidence in a criminal investigation. She opened the medicine cabinet, reading the labels on the medications with an interest that made me uncomfortable. "Anxiolytics, Sophie?" she asked, taking a box. "You never told me you were taking these." I saw my wife crumble. Those medications, she had started taking them precisely because of the stress her mother caused her, but of course, she couldn't say that. "It's temporary," Sophie murmured. "Just to help me manage the stress of the move." Margaret put the box down with a theatrical sigh that clearly insinuated that the move was not the real reason. In the bedrooms, her inspection became even more invasive. She opened our closets without hesitation, commenting on the way our clothes were organized. "Your husband's shirts are quite wrinkled, Sophie. Your grandmother taught you to iron properly." I saw Sophie bite her lip. Those shirts, I had told her 100 times that I preferred to iron them myself, but now was not the time to mention it. In the guest room, Margaret lingered longer than necessary, mentally measuring the space, observing the orientation of the windows, testing the firmness of the mattress. Her behavior was starting to put me on alert, but I was far from imagining what was to come. She took a tape measure out of her purse, who carries a tape measure for a simple visit, and began measuring the walls. "This room would make a perfect master bedroom," she commented. "Yours is smaller, isn't it?" The office underwent the same meticulous examination. Margaret turned on the laptop I had forgotten to close, scanning the screen before I could intervene. "Unpaid bills?" she asked, pointing to an open email. "It's the community fees," I explained, uncomfortable. "We always receive them in advance." She nodded unconvincingly, continuing her investigation. Every drawer was opened, every document reviewed. I felt violated in my privacy, but how could I tell my wife's mother to mind her own business? In the hallway, she stopped in front of the photos of our wedding. "That dress really wasn't the best choice," she commented, looking at Sophie. "I told you at the time, but you never listened to my advice." Sophie, who had loved that dress and felt magnificent on our wedding day, looked down. I felt my blood boil, but I held back. Once again, the garage, my last refuge, did not escape her inspection. She looked at my tools with disdain, stopping in front of my workbench. "All this mess. It's dangerous, you know? And if you had children?" The issue of children, a sensitive topic she brought up every visit. Sophie and I had decided to wait, but for Margaret, it was just another proof that our marriage wasn't serious. After 2 hours of exhaustive inspection, Margaret finally returned to the living room. Her expression was unreadable, but I felt something was brewing. She sat on our sofa, smoothed her skirt, and looked at us with an intensity that chilled my blood. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret sat upright on our sofa, her hands clasped on her knees, looking at us with an expression I couldn't decipher. Sophie and I remained standing, like two defendants awaiting their sentence. "Well," Margaret began, her voice suddenly softer than it had been since her arrival, "I must admit that this house is surprising." I held my breath, waiting for the criticism that was sure to follow. But against all odds, a small smile appeared on her face. "In fact, I find it really charming," she continued, taking us completely by surprise. "The brightness is perfect, the layout is practical, and although some decorating choices are, let's say, peculiar, the overall effect is quite successful." Sophie relaxed slightly beside me, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Maybe this visit wasn't going to be the disaster we had imagined. Maybe Margaret had finally decided to accept our decisions and trust us. "The neighborhood is quiet," Margaret continued, looking out the window. "The neighbors seem respectable. And that guest room." She paused, tapping the armrest of the sofa thoughtfully. "It's really ideal." Something in her voice made me uneasy. It wasn't the tone she usually used to give a compliment. There was something else, a kind of anticipation in her voice that chilled my blood. "Mom," Sophie said, relieved, "I'm so glad you like our house. We were so afraid you'd find it too modest or—" "No, no," Margaret interrupted, waving her hand. "It's perfect. Absolutely perfect. In fact," She straightened even more, if that was possible, and gave us a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It's exactly what I need. Sophie and I looked at each other, confused. The initial relief was beginning to turn into apprehension. Margaret wasn't the type to give compliments without reason. What you need? Sophie repeated hesitantly. Yes, dear, Margaret replied in a syrupy voice. You know, since your father left, that big house has become so empty, so quiet. And now that you have this lovely place, with that spacious guest room. My stomach tightened. I was beginning to understand where she was going, and panic was rising in me like a wave. I've thought about it a lot, she continued, her tone becoming more confident with each word. My house is too big for one person. The maintenance costs a fortune, and frankly, at my age, it would be more reasonable to be close to my family. Sophie stiffened beside me. She had understood too. But before either of us could say anything, Margaret dropped her bombshell. I've decided to sell my house and move in here with you. Time stopped. The words hung in the air like a threat. I felt as if someone had just poured a bucket of cold water over my head. Can you imagine how perfect it would be? Margaret continued, seeming not to notice our stupefaction. I could see my daughter every day, help you with the house, God knows you need it, and when you finally have children, I'll be here to take care of them. She was now speaking animatedly, unfolding her plan as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if our agreement was a foregone conclusion. I've already contacted a real estate agent, Margaret continued, taking her phone out of her purse. He thinks my house could sell in 2 months. Which gives us enough time to reorganize the guest room. We'll need to change those curtains, of course, and maybe repaint the walls in a more appropriate color. She kept talking, describing all the changes she planned to make to our house, as if it were already hers. Sophie was petrified beside me, her hand squeezing mine so tightly I could no longer feel it. And the office could easily be transformed into a dressing room, Margaret continued. You really don't need a whole room to work, do you? A small corner in the living room would be enough. Every word she spoke was like another nail in the coffin of our tranquility. She had planned everything, organized everything, without even consulting us. It was typical of Margaret, deciding for others and presenting her decisions as fait accompli. I think I could even bring my piano, she added, looking around as if she were already deciding where to place it. It would add a touch of class to this room, don't you think? The piano. The instrument she hadn't played in years but kept as a sacred relic. The idea of that massive piano in our small living room, taking up all the space, was the last straw. I felt something break inside me. All the frustration, all the irritation I had accumulated over years of condescending comments and barely veiled criticisms was about to explode. No. The word came out of my mouth before I could think. Simple, direct, definitive. Margaret froze mid-sentence, her pen suspended over the notebook where she had begun to jot down her remodeling plans. Sophie gave a small gasp of surprise beside me. Excuse me? Margaret's voice was low, dangerous like the rumble of an approaching storm. I said no, I repeated, surprised by my own calm. It's not possible. You can't move in here. The silence that followed was electric. Margaret looked at me as if I had just announced that the earth was flat. Her face went from surprise to incredulity, then to anger in a matter of seconds. I don't believe I asked for your opinion, she replied coldly, addressing me but looking at Sophie. It's my daughter's house as much as yours. Our house, I corrected, feeling the anger rise in me like a wave. Sophie and I bought this house together. We chose each room, each piece of furniture, each color together. It's our home. Sophie was trembling slightly beside me, torn between her husband and her mother. I could feel her internal conflict, but I couldn't back down. Not this time. Dear, Margaret said, deliberately ignoring my presence to address Sophie directly. You're not going to let him talk to your mother like that, are you? After everything I've done for you. Sophie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I saw the struggle in her eyes, years of emotional manipulation against the life she had chosen with me. It's not about disrespect, I resumed, trying to keep a calm voice. It's about boundaries. This house is our space, our life together. We need that privacy. Margaret let out a dry laugh, devoid of humor. Privacy? At your age? Don't be ridiculous. What you need is help. Look at this place. She gestured around the living room. The dust, the mess, the industrial meals in the fridge. My poor Sophie deserves better than this. My wife is not your poor Sophie, I replied, feeling my voice tremble slightly. She's an adult who makes her own decisions. Our lifestyle may not please you, but it's ours. Decisions? Margaret stood up, dominating the room with her height. What decisions? To live in a poorly maintained house? To eat ready-made meals? To take anxiolytics? That last blow was low, even for her. I saw Sophie flinch as if she had been slapped. Enough, I said firmly. You have no right to. No right? She interrupted me. I am her mother. I have every right. Who are you to tell me what I can or cannot do? The tension in the room had become unbearable. Every word was like a match thrown onto a pile of gunpowder. I could feel Sophie trembling beside me, caught between two fires. I am her husband, I replied calmly, drawing on reserves of patience I didn't know I had. And this house is our home. Not a retirement home, not a refuge for mothers-in-law, our home. Margaret turned to Sophie, deliberately ignoring my response. Dear, you can't let him talk to me like that. After all I've sacrificed for you. Sophie looked down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Margaret's face softened instantly. Remember when you were little? When you were scared, you always came to my bed. I protected you from everything. I can still do that. I felt nauseous at such emotional manipulation. Every word was calculated, every gesture choreographed to maximize its impact on Sophie. I give you a week, Margaret declared, taking her purse with a theatrical gesture. A week to make the right decision. Either I move in here, or... She left her sentence hanging, looking insistently at Sophie. Or you start looking for a good lawyer. Sophie collapsed on the sofa, her sobs now clearly audible. I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, but she was so tense it was like hugging a statue. You can't do this, I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. You can't make her choose between her husband and her mother. Margaret straightened her suit with a precise gesture. I'm not asking her to choose. I'm just showing her the way to a better life. A life where her mother can take care of her, like before. Like before? I exploded. You mean when she needed anxiolytics just to cope with your constant criticism? When she cried after every one of your visits? A flash of something, perhaps guilt, crossed Margaret's face, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. You know nothing about our relationship, she hissed. Nothing at all. She headed for the front door, her heels echoing on the wooden floor like a countdown. Before leaving, she turned one last time. A week, Sophie. Think about everything your mother has done for you. Think about what really matters in life. The door closed behind her with a bang that echoed throughout the house. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Sophie's muffled sobs. After Margaret's departure, we stayed in the living room for a long time, paralyzed by what had just happened. The last rays of the sun were streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. Those same walls that Margaret had inspected with such disdain a few hours earlier. Maybe we should go to the bedroom, I finally suggested softly. We'll be more comfortable talking there. Sophie nodded mechanically, getting up like an automaton. I followed her to our bedroom, the room that had become our refuge since we moved in. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. I'm sorry, she murmured after a long silence. I'm so sorry. I didn't think she would go this far. I sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. She was still trembling slightly. You don't have to apologize for her. It's not your fault. But it is, she replied, the tears starting to flow again. I should have seen it coming. The questions about the guest room, her sudden interest in our house. I should have realized she was planning something. How could you have guessed she planned to impose herself in our home? I asked gently. No one could have foreseen that. Sophie got up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth in the room. You don't understand. It's exactly her style. To meddle in my life, to make decisions for me, to use guilt as a weapon. She stopped in front of the window, looking outside without really seeing. When I approached her, gently placing my hands on her shoulders. But you're not that little girl anymore, Sophie. You're a grown woman, strong and independent. Really? She asked with a bitter laugh. Then why do I still feel so powerless in front of her? Why can't I stand up to her? The silence fell between us again, heavy with unanswered questions. Outside, a car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating our room with a ghostly glow. What are we going to do? She finally asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. We have several options, I replied, trying to stay pragmatic. We could accept. No, she interrupted me firmly, surprising me with her vehemence. No, we can't accept. It would be the end of our marriage. Are you sure? I asked, wanting to be sure she had thought through all the implications. I mean, it would be difficult, but if it's what it takes to keep the peace in your family. Sophie turned to me, and I saw in her eyes a determination I had never seen before. Peace? What peace? Do you really think she would let us live in peace? She would criticize every one of our decisions, meddle in every aspect of our lives. This wouldn't be our home anymore, it would be hers. She sat back down on the bed, taking her head in her hands. And the children? My God, can you imagine having children with her living here? She would take total control of their upbringing, just like she did with me. I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Then we refuse. But what if she follows through on her threat? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. What if she really tries to separate us? She can't force us to divorce, I replied gently. It's not up to her to decide our future. It's up to us. Sophie nodded slowly, as if she were gradually absorbing that truth. You're right. It's our life, our decisions. She took a deep breath. We have to confront her. Together. The next morning, we didn't even wait a week. Sophie called her mother first thing, her voice trembling but determined. Mom, we need to talk. Now. Margaret arrived an hour later, dressed in another of her impeccable suits, as if she were heading to a business meeting instead of a family conversation. This time, we waited for her in the living room, Sophie and I sitting together on the sofa, united in our resolve. Dear, Margaret began as she entered, deliberately ignoring my presence. I suppose you've made the right decision, haven't you? Sophie squeezed my hand tighter, finding courage in that contact. Yes, Mom. I've made my decision. Margaret sat down in the armchair opposite us, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. She took a notebook out of her purse, probably filled with plans for her move. I knew you would understand, she said in a syrupy voice. We could start moving my things this weekend. I've already contacted a moving company, Anne. No, Mom, Sophie interrupted, her voice firmer than I had ever heard it. You're not moving in here. Margaret's smile froze on her face. Excuse me? You heard me, Sophie continued, her voice gaining confidence with each word. This house is our home, Thomas and mine. Not yours. Margaret's face instantly hardened. I see, she said coldly. He's turned you against me. Exactly as I feared. No, Mom. No one turns me against you. Not anymore. Those last words hit Margaret like a slap. She straightened in her chair, her gaze quickly shifting from Sophie to me. Not anymore, she repeated, her voice dangerously low. What exactly are you implying? I'm implying that for years, you've controlled every aspect of my life. My decisions, my choices, my relationships. But that's over now. Margaret laughed, a sound devoid of joy. Controlled? I protected you. I guided you. Without me, where would you be today? Probably happier, Sophie murmured, and I felt my heart ache at the pain in her voice. More confident. Less anxious. How dare you? Margaret stood up abruptly, her notebook falling to the floor. After everything I've sacrificed for you. Sacrifices don't give you the right to control someone else's life, I said, speaking up for the first time. Not even a mother's. Margaret glared at me. You, stay out of this. This is between my daughter and me. No, Sophie said, standing up as well. Thomas is my husband. We're a team. If you want to talk to me, you have to talk to him too. A team. Margaret spat the word like an insult. He's completely turned you against me. No one has turned me against you, Mom. I've just opened my eyes. To everything. To how you manipulate me, to how you use guilt as a weapon, to how you try to control my life. The words were now pouring out like a torrent, years of frustration and fear finally coming to light. You threaten me with divorce if I don't do what you want. Is that a mother's love? Is that the protection you always talk about? Margaret paled slightly but quickly recovered. I do this for your own good. Can't you see that? For my own good. Sophie was now trembling with anger rather than fear. My own good would be to live my own life, make my own decisions, have a normal relationship with my mother. Not this. The door slammed shut with a final thunderous sound. Margaret had left, leaving behind a deafening silence and an electric atmosphere. Sophie stood in the middle of the living room for what seemed like an eternity, staring at the spot where her mother had been moments before. Margaret's last words still hung in the air. You'll regret this, my dear. One day you'll understand that everything I did was out of love. When Sophie finally collapsed onto the sofa, it wasn't in tears as I had expected. She seemed different. As if a huge weight had just been lifted off her shoulders, although that relief came with a new kind of sadness. Are you okay? I asked softly, sitting beside her. She nodded slowly. I think so. It's just strange. All these years, I was so afraid of standing up to her. And now that I've done it, I feel free. I suggested. Yes, but also guilty. Does that make me a bad daughter? I took her hand in mine. No, it makes you an adult who makes her own decisions. It's normal and healthy. The days that followed were strangely quiet. There were no insistent messages from Margaret, no calls, no surprise visits. That silence was new to us, almost unsettling in its tranquility. Sophie began to notice subtle changes in her daily life. She no longer jumped when the phone rang. She no longer compulsively checked if the house was perfectly tidy before going to bed. The little habits born from years of constant criticism were starting to fade away. One night, while we were having dinner in the kitchen, she suddenly laughed as she spilled a bit of sauce on the table. What's funny? I asked, surprised by her reaction. I just realized that I didn't immediately think about what Mom would say about my clumsiness, she replied, calmly wiping up the spill. Before, I would have panicked at the thought of her seeing that. This simple observation said a lot about the changes happening in her. The invisible walls that Margaret had built around her daughter were starting to crumble, one by one. But it wasn't always easy. Some nights, Sophie would look at old family photos, and I would find her lost in thought, her eyes wet. A month after the confrontation, we received a letter from Margaret. Sophie kept it on the kitchen table for 2 days before finding the courage to open it. Inside, there were no apologies, no acknowledgement of her mistakes, just a photo of her in front of her new house in another city, with a brief note, I've decided to start over. She's moving, Sophie murmured, her voice a mix of relief and sadness. She's really leaving. This news marked a turning point in our life. Our house truly became our space, without Margaret's shadow looming over every decision, every decorating choice, every moment of our daily life. Sophie started therapy, not to manage the anxiety caused by her mother, but to rebuild herself, to understand who she really was without Margaret's constant influence. Little by little, I saw her blossom, make decisions without hesitation, assert her tastes and desires. One night, while we were rearranging the living room to our liking, moving the furniture without worrying about Margaret's rules, Sophie stopped in the middle of the room. You know, she said, I think I'm starting to understand what it really means to have a home. It's not just a place that's perfectly tidy or decorated according to someone else's standards. It's a place where you can be yourself. I smiled as I looked at her. The anxious and hesitant woman she had been a few months earlier had given way to someone stronger, more confident. Our house had finally become what it should have always been, a refuge, a place of peace and love, our home. Margaret's threat had never materialized. Our relationship, instead of breaking under the pressure, had strengthened. We had weathered that storm together and emerged more united than ever. Life went on, different but better. And although the relationship between Sophie and her mother would probably always be complicated, we now knew we could face anything, as long as we stayed true to ourselves and our values.